Good morning. You need headphones. So if you have your own, I encourage you to use those. Ask the sub if you can leave the room and go grab them out of your locker if that's the case. If you have them on you, pop them in right now. If you don't have headphones at all, I have about 5 or 6 pairs in the classroom. Look over by the window. You will see a sign that says Student Supplies. On the lowest shelf close to the floor, there's about 5 or 6 sets of headphones. So please pause now and make sure you have headphones in. Well, hello everybody. It's Thursday, October 11th, and this is 7th grade history. And you will be watching this video for the next, 50 to 60 minutes, and it will walk you through today's lesson. You will be pausing several times in order to write things down, so be prepared to pause. Also, don't fast forward through things. Please watch the whole video and only watch this video, meaning the temptation to go elsewhere on your computer. Resist that temptation, please, and stick to this video so you can get through the tasks. All right, let's get started. Last time in class you made a prediction, and it was in your journal. You had to answer the question, what reasons led the colonies away from indentured servitude toward slavery as a source of labor? And you wrote your answer inside your journal. What I'd like you to do now is write your response on the whiteboard. So you're going to grab a pen from the middle table, the blue table. You will see there are whiteboard pens. Go to one of the whiteboard spaces in the back of the room, not on the calendar, please, mainly underneath the word predictions, and small enough so that everybody has a chance to put their prediction on there. Write down your response. Pause now. Okay, we're going to take some more notes. So last time you took notes, if you recall, you were here. Roman numeral 1, pros and cons of indentured servitude. That's what the notes page was called. Now you're going to be taking notes called end of indentured servitude. So you're going to create a whole new notes page. So turn to the next right side that's open and call it end of indentured servitude. And it is technically Roman numeral 2 because we're continuing our talk of indentured servitude. And then please write today's date, which is 10/11/2018. All right, ending of indentured servitude. There are 4 reasons why indentured servitude ended. So please pay attention to the words in bold. They're the most important things. So uppercase A, ending of indentured servitude. Lowercase a, first of all, indentured servitude was temporary. Planters had to continually replace workers and train new ones. This was costly. And when you didn't have indentured servants working during sometimes a short growing season, because a lot of times, most of the time they worked on a farm, you would lose production, you would lose money. And if you recall, 60% of indentured servants didn't make it through their 7-year term. So this meant that you were replacing them quite frequently. So production was being lost. So it was costly, and it was temporary. You only had that person for 4 to 7 years at best. Lowercase b, and second reason, they can easily escape. Those indentured servants were English citizens, and they could blend into the colonial population easily, and it was difficult to recapture them. C, there was a limited supply, especially by 1666. So Britain in 1666 has a huge fire. They need labor to rebuild the city. As a result, they're not encouraging people to go to the colonies as indentured servants. This lessens the supply going to the colonies, and as you recall, the colonies really needed a lot of labor to make especially the farming work and make it productive and make a profit and make it worth its while. So limited supply. And D, or the fourth reason, a lot of people had a moral dilemma. They didn't want to treat other English citizens essentially like enslaved labor. Now, yes, It wasn't completely enslaved labor. These people did have, indentured servants did have some rights. However, there were aspects of it that were like enslaved labor. You were not paid and you had to do very harsh work. But these people had a moral dilemma. They felt badly treating citizens, British citizens, like that. Uppercase B. Slavery is preferred source of labor. And you're going to see that it already existed, African slavery. So a precedent was already set. So notice I've uppercase B, finger space in lowercase a, and now I have a lowercase Roman numeral 1. So a precedent was set by Spain and Portugal, who were already using African enslaved people or African slave labor in the Caribbean and in South America. So the British could do the same thing that the Portuguese and the Spanish were already doing. There was already a system in place for trading enslaved labor. And 2, Africans were already in the colonies as indentured servants, so that precedent was set. So a transition to full-on enslaved labor could be more fluid or might be easier to do for the people that were in power in the colonies. So think back to your prediction. Were you able to make a good prediction as to why indentured servitude didn't work and the transition or the preference of enslaved labor might have been preferred? Okay, at this point, you are going to pull out the need to knows. You probably want 1 or 2 need to knows for uppercase A. Probably want 1 need to know for uppercase B. Then you are going to write your summary. So sorry, pause now and pull out the need to knows, write your summary. Okay, we're kind of moving into new territory now. You have just finished pulling out need to knows and writing the summary for end of indentured servitude. We're now moving into talking about more enslaved labor and maybe the roots of enslaved labor. So a new source of labor, and here's your to-do right now. Create a new journal page called Switch to Slavery. So pause now and create that new journal page. You can put that new journal page, you probably want to make a whole new page where the left and the right side are blank. So go to that new page and create Switch to Slavery left side journal page. Pause now. Okay, also take note with your planner that you have homework. Okay, and the 2 things of homework that you're doing this evening, 1, you're going to pull out need to knows for switch to African slavery, and that's due Friday, 10/12, so tomorrow. You're also going to do you're going to read a Junior Scholastic article, and I'll go over this homework at the end of this presentation, and I will specify the article, and you're going to be pulling out the 5 W's, and that's also due Monday, 10/12. So you have 2 things to do tonight. Read this article, pull out the need to knows for the switch to African slavery, but we're really going to be talking about ancient versus American slavery. All right, so this is going to be primarily for your journal page that we're going to focus on. So I'm going to read this aloud to you, even though I know you can read. So it's called Slavery in Historical Perspective. Slavery in the United States was not unique in treating human beings like animals. The institution of slavery could be found in societies as diverse as ancient Assyria, Babylonia, China, Egypt, India, Persia, and Mesopotamia. In classical Greece and Rome, in Africa, the Islamic world, and among the New World Indians. At the time of Christ, there were probably between 2 and 3 million enslaved people in Italy, making up to 35 to 40% of the population. So slavery is nothing new. It's been around for a long time all around the world. It is not something unique to America or the Americas. England's Doomsday Book of 1086 indicated that 10% of the population was enslaved. Among some Indian tribes of the Pacific Northwest, nearly a quarter of the population consisted of enslaved labor. In 1644, just before the Dutch ceded Manhattan to the British, that's in New York, 40% of the population consisted of enslaved Africans. So that's just Dutch holdings that were in the middle colonies. It is notable that the modern word for slaves comes from Slav. During the Middle Ages, most slaves in Europe and the Islamic world were people from Slavic Eastern Europe. It was only in the 15th century that slavery became linked with people from sub-Saharan Africa. And also note that the preferred term is enslaved person. So instead of calling the person a slave, you call that person an enslaved person. So it's a person in the state of slavery. It's important to note that they are still a person. They're not this thing called a slave. So now you have some history behind slavery and its long, long history. Now, you're going to read The Newness of New World Slavery, and then in your journal identify 4 ways how New World slavery differed from ancient slavery. I'm going to click on this and we'll read it together. Okay, remember, in your journal, you're writing down 4 ways that ancient slavery differed from New World slavery, and this is in your journal. So the newness of New World slavery. Was the slavery that developed in the New World fundamentally different from the kinds of servitude found in classical antiquity or in other societies? In other words, was ancient slavery different than the new slavery or the slavery that we've been noted in American history? In one respect, New World slavery clearly was not unique. Slavery everywhere permitted cruelty and abuse. In ancient India, Saxon England, and ancient China, a master might mistreat or even kill an enslaved person with impunity. Yet, in 4 fundamental respects, New World slavery, or American slavery, differed from the slavery in classical antiquity and in Africa, Eastern and Central Asia, or the Middle East. So all that ancient slavery that we were talking about, American slavery differed from it in 4 ways. 1. Slavery in the classical and early medieval worlds was not based on racial distinctions. So racial slavery originated during the Middle Ages, when Christians and Muslims increasingly began to recruit enslaved people from East, North Central, and West Africa. As late as the 15th century, slavery did not automatically mean black slavery. Many slaves came from Crimea and the Balkans and the steppes of Western Asia. But after 1453, when the Ottoman Turks captured Constantinople, the capital of Eastern Christendom, Christian enslaved traders drew increasingly upon captive black Muslims known as Moors, and upon enslaved people purchased on the West African coast and transported across the Sahara Desert. So we see that there was this slow transition to using people from sub-Saharan Africa, but slavery's origins was really from all over, and there wasn't a racial distinction. In other words, it was more who your enemy was rather than what your race was. In the ancient world, this is number 2, in the ancient world did not necessarily regard slavery as a preeminent condition. In many societies, including ancient Greece and Rome, manumission of enslaved people was common, and a former enslaved person carried little stigma from their previous status. So in other words, you were not born an enslaved person. You weren't designated a slave. In other words, you could, if you may have been captured during a battle and then became placed into a state of enslaved labor, but you might not be that person, that type of person for the rest of your life. American slavery, a little different. You were born an enslaved person and marked a slave. Number 3, slaves did not necessarily hold the lowest status in pre-modern societies. In classical Greece, many educators, scholars, poets, and physicians were in fact enslaved labor. So in the Americas, think about it. Were enslaved Africans and African Americans the lowest on the social ladder in terms of having power? Yeah. But back in the day, in ancient times, sometimes they served as educators, scholars, poets, and physicians. So they didn't hold that lowest social status. 4, it was only in the New World, which is the Americas, that slavery provided the labor force for a high-pressure, profit-making capitalist system of plantation agriculture producing cotton, sugar, coffee, cocoa. Plantation agriculture, pardon for the break there, cotton, sugar, coffee, and cocoa for distant markets. Most enslaved people in Africa, in the Islamic world, and in the New World prior to European colonization worked as farmers or household servants, or served as concubines or eunuchs. They were symbols of prestige, luxury, and power rather than a source of labor. So in the ancient times, enslaved labor was a marker for how wealthy you were. And that was the same in the Americas as well. But the real driving force for enslaved labor in the Americas was to make a profit off of agriculture or cash crops. So, now in your journal, and hopefully you were doing this all along, you can always go back and look at the article, just rewind a little bit. What are 4 ways that New World slavery or slavery in the Americas differed from ancient slavery? Write those 4 differences with details in your journal. Pause now. Okay, you are going to be creating a new notes page. And this new notes page is called Ancient versus American Slavery. So you already made a notes page for the ending of indentured servitude. Now you're going to be making a whole new notes page called Ancient versus American Slavery. You can put this next to the journal page you just made. And then today's date, 10/11/2018. Pause now. All right, here is the most difficult task perhaps. You may want to use a ruler. You need to create this table in your notes section of that new notes page, Ancient versus American Slavery. And I suggest you turn your notebook sideways. So in other words, turn it so that the long side is facing you, that you're not doing this the long way, is not vertical, but rather it's horizontal. And you're going to create this table that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 boxes. Down the side, acquisition, treatment, term. Up top, ancient, American. And you're going to want to make this look almost exactly like this. The bullets, you will be using bullets in your notes. You don't need to include those when you make your table. You include those when you start adding information to this. But right now you want to just create this table. So pause now. All right, we're going to start with the notes. So, acquisition. In the ancient world, you acquired enslaved labor through war. And anyone from anywhere could be enslaved. It all depended on who was fighting. So it was usually linked to war, and it was kind of a punishment or a spoil of war. In American slavery, you bought and sold enslaved people. They were part of an economy, meaning you might be trading, they were a good that was traded and oftentimes led to other goods being moved around or money. So you could trade enslaved labor for money, and then that money could be used to purchase something else. It fueled an economy. Also in American enslaved labor, People were kidnapped and captured by slave traders. They were not acquired through war. And finally, they were from Africa. They were not from anywhere, as noted here, but they were from Africa, mainly Western Africa. Okay, treatment. So it varied. It could be very harsh. People were replaced easily and they were expendable, meaning that that enslaved labor came and went. You might lose a person because they didn't serve as an enslaved person for life. But also expendable means sometimes that they could just be killed off and weren't cared about all that much. Could be a normal part of a culture in ancient times. So in other words, having enslaved labor was just normal. It was the way things were. Whereas when it was brought to the Americas, and that African version that we'll talk about, where you have enslaved labor that's from Africa, it wasn't a part of British culture. It was adopted mainly from what was being used by the Spanish and the Portuguese in the Americas. And then title or condition. So treatment, you had a title or condition, meaning that you had a particularly sometimes you had a length of time that wasn't that long. And then condition would be there were certain conditions of your enslaved labor, that you only had to do certain types of work in ancient times, that you weren't just at the disposal of the master. And sometimes the jobs you were doing varied quite a bit. So what you were called, remember how we said some people were physicians, some people were doctors or educators? They might be that, but still be enslaved. Or your condition. You weren't just all farm hands working to fuel this cash crop economy. Okay, now on to American slavery. Enslaved labor in the Americas was an investment. The enslaved labor, because it was an investment, because a person spent money on an enslaved person, they were treated just good enough to work as long as possible. So being fed just enough, being clothed just enough, sheltered just enough, having their health needs treated just enough so that you could continue to work. Otherwise, the investment wasn't worth it. And also, enslaved labor was expensive to replace. It was a social status. If you had a lot of enslaved people on your plantation, let's say, that meant you were very wealthy. And that meant that enslaved labor was expensive. It was a marker of wealth. So expensive to replace. Remember over here it said they were easily expendable, whereas here, expensive. So look at the differences between these two. Finally, term. Life. Often cut short because of work. So in ancient times, people did serve for a life term, but if the work was done, like the building of something, sometimes the term was cut short and the person was released. And a person could also buy or earn his or her freedom by the work that they did. So freedom could be achieved. In American version of slavery, you served for life. The longer, the better for people that owned enslaved labor. They wanted people for life. And also, owner decides about freedom. There wasn't this system where you could purchase or buy your freedom or earn it. Rather, it was up to the master or the owner to determine whether or not you could buy your freedom or not. And even if you had the means, the ways to do it, the owner could still say, no, that's my property and I don't feel like selling. So now you have this table complete. Tonight's homework is going to involve pulling out the need to knows. You probably want to pull out one need to know for each one of these groups, acquisition, treatment, and term, and you probably want to compare the ancient to the American version in your pullout. So pick the one main thing or one deciding compare and contrast. So how do they contrast from one another? How do they differ? All right. So that's homework tonight. We're now going to pause here, and you're going to move into a whole new area. So we're going to be working on something else, and it is called visual notes. And this is a way of taking notes where you're using pictures rather than words. And so doodling is encouraged. But there is a style and a way of doing visual notes, and I'm going to introduce that today. Here is an example of visual notes. You can see how people are drawn, how certain people here are drawn, how other things are represented by images. And so if you have a set code of images, you can draw these, make these doodles, and it all means the same thing as words. And it's also sometimes a faster way to take notes, and also a more engaging way to take notes, because you are doodling, you're drawing pictures. Finally, a lot of people are visual learners. They learn by seeing things. So if you can visually see the notes, it helps you remember them better. And a lot of times this year we'll be taking notes that are in words and changing them into visual notes. Okay, so here's just, we're going to talk about an example. It says World War II Europe, visual notes, and draw the basic shapes above the word. So a square, and you can see a square being built here, and then this would be a rectangle. They're used a lot for basic shapes, and then things are added on to squares. So you're going to see a lot of squares in the work. Circles are used a lot. The letter O to make a circle. And then you use the circle a lot of times to show cycles or things going around. Triangle shapes are used quite a bit, using the letter V and then capping that V off with a straight line to create a triangle. Lines, you can see lines are being used a lot in visual notes. And then dots. So dots mark different things or can represent numbers. So the basic shapes of visual notes are rectangles and squares, triangles and circles. So you really want to get used to using those as kind of the core or the base of when you're taking visual notes, and then you'll spiral things off of there. And you'll see that these three shapes are the building blocks of your doodles. So keep that in mind. Basic shapes: squares, rectangles, triangles, and circles. And here is visual notes in action, and it also has the different type of people. You have kind of this squiggle person, which you make a head, and a lot of times when you're taking notes you want to have people. That head is on a squiggly body, and then you make the arms and the legs. The legs almost look like a putter, and this is called a squiggle person. And you can make the legs and arms with a lowercase b's and d's. Here's those lowercase b's and d's, and that squiggle is the body. Another type of person is called the star person. So you make the head, and then you make an arm, and then you make the two legs, and then you have this star person created. So that's another way of representing a person. Notice there's a difference. Usually if you want to show this person, it's one person standing out. If you use this star person, generally you're making a group of people. But you can use both. Then you have a person called a bean person. Head, and then this bean-shaped body. It's almost like a U. And then you have the arms and the legs making those lowercase b's and d's. Same thing with the arms, and this person's called a bean person. These are the basic people used in visual notes. Squiggle people, star people, bean people. You can pick whichever one works best for you. And then add punctuation and scenery to your people for more dynamic doodling. You could add this question mark to this bean person to show the person's thinking. This bean person's running just by adding these lines. They look like they're moving swiftly. This person's standing in front of something. So they're holding something up, which looks kind of like a background or a wall. This person's holding a pose. So you can show expressions by how you shape those basic bodies. So you're going to be using these types of people: squiggle, star, and bean people. These are notes, I believe, taken by Mr. Law, and he can see this is how we did it during a conference that we all went to. And you can see the words are interspersed throughout, but you see those basic shapes. You see triangles all throughout, or rectangles. You see a circle here. You see a bean person. This bean person's helping this bean person up a step. And you can see bringing teachers aboard. So you can use words in your visual notes as well. It's totally encouraged. But you can see all those basic shapes. Here's more bean people sitting down. Here's circles that are showing different phases of a process. So this is a good example of how visual notes should look. This was all written in words first, or you could totally write this in words, but Mr. Law decided he wanted to make it into visual notes. Okay, here is your task. On the front table or the blue table are sheets of paper that look like this. You're going to be creating visual notes for indentured servants. Okay, so for those indentured servitude notes. And use this sheet to practice shapes and symbols for visual note taking. And here you have some different basic shapes that you can use. Kind of connectors, arrows, and whatnot that connect things. Containers, different ways of the circle, the square, and the rectangle. Fluffy cloud can be used, a title or banner. Text, using words in your visual notes, and bullets. So these help. Using the plus sign is really helpful a lot of times. So you can practice making people right here in this space. So you should pause now and go get the sheet of paper. Right now in this space, I want you to practice making the three types of people. A bean person, a star person, and a squiggle person. So again, you're going to make those three types of people. I'm going to go back and show you what they look like. You can pause here in order to finish that off. Okay, next, you're going to create images for the following concepts above the word. Create a symbol for cash crop, or actually I'm going to have you create 3 symbols. What are 3 ways that you could show cash crops? Some person might make a bushel or a big bag with a dollar sign on it and have hay sticking out of the top of it, right? That's one way. Passage to colonies. How could you make a symbol that shows that? Cheap labor. This might need to include a person. How can you show, though, that it is cheap or affordable labor? Trade. What is a symbol or 3 symbols you could use to represent trade? Resources. In the colonies, I want you to think of those different resources like lumber, like fisheries, like cash crops, whether it is cotton or indigo or tobacco. Sometimes it's small farms, mining. Those are the different resources in the colonies. You should try to create 5 or 6 of those. Harsh conditions. What symbol could you use to show difficult conditions? That things are bad. Maybe fire or a hot sun or something along those lines. Those are just ideas. You might have a better one. How can you show moving up the social ladder or moving up socially? A ladder might be a good symbol. Limited supply, meaning there's not a lot of this particular item or object or commodity that you need. How can you show that it's limited or less? So create a symbol for that. Temporary workers. How can you show that work is temporary, that it doesn't last a lifetime? And then can escape easily. How can you show somebody escaping easily? What symbol could you use? Think of that bean person moving swiftly. So your job is to come up with 1 to 3 symbols for each one of these terms and just draw the symbol below. And then later on in your notes, you're going to be using these quite frequently when you create visual notes. But you'll have this kind of dictionary of symbols here. Okay, pause now and finish this sheet. Okay, your homework. Here it is specified, and after I'm done talking, you can pause to get this all written down. This will all be placed on Google Classroom. More than likely, it will be placed between 3:15 and 3:30 tonight or this afternoon. So, need to knows. So first, you're pulling out the need to knows for ancient versus American slavery. That was the table you made. Use the Q column to answer the following question. What are the 3 main differences between ancient and American forms of slavery? Once you pull out the need to knows that answer that question, then you can write your summary. But you're going to be writing your summary in class tomorrow. You're just pulling out the need to knows. Repeat, only pulling out the need to knows, and it should probably answer this question. What are the 3 main differences between ancient and American forms of slavery? So you probably want to have 3 need to knows showing those differences. Next homework is Junior Scholastic. you're going to create a whole new notes page called Election Article and give it the date, which is going to be 10/11/2018. You could pause now and create that. You're going to read "This election could change your future" on pages 8 to 13 in the Junior Scholastic magazine. The magazine is on the blue table in the front of the room. You want to take one of those home with you. You're going to take notes that answer the following questions. So I highly recommend on your notes page you create these prompts: A, B, C, D, E, etc. And the first one, A, what are the 5 ways to take action? Write that down, and then your subtopics, lowercase a, lowercase b, could be the 5 ways that you respond to that. Who is featured in the article? People, groups. So that's your uppercase B. Lowercase a, b, c, etc. are the different groups of people represented in this article. Uppercase C. When is the topic taking place? So there, you're responding to when is this topic important? Are any dates mentioned? Any time frames mentioned? Uppercase D. Where is the topic happening? Be specific. Are there certain towns, places, areas, regions named? And this is your uppercase D, and your lowercase letters will respond to that question. And then you have uppercase E. Why did the author write this article? That's where you want to think deeply about why did the author sit down and actually write this article for you to consume as a reader. You can just give one reason for that, so one lowercase a. And then uppercase F, how did this article impact you? And there give one reason for how did it change you as a person after reading this article. You took in new information, therefore you are changed even if it's ever so slightly. So these are the questions that you are answering. Check the Classroom page in order to get the details on this, because this will all be on Classroom, both of them. All right, thank you for listening.